This has really shifted on its head in the last 10 years. It used to be that the immigrants are taking the jobs, and now it's immigrants doing too many jobs and we don't have enough robots. The small boat issue has certainly had a toxifying effect on this. I mean, you saw a moderating effect after Brexit on people's views about immigration because of this idea that it could be controlled now. We have a sovereign right to decide. Small boats has taken that completely in the opposite direction. So it's a massive export for us, and of course the immigrants subsidise the capped fees for everybody else. On the dependence thing, again, they have a point that will obviously make immigration more of a net fiscal burden if you have people not working.
A new report released this week claims that high levels of immigration to the UK are failing to deliver the promised benefits. Former Ministers Robert Jenrick and Neil O'Brien are saying that immigration has failed to deliver boosts to economic growth, while it's also placing burdens on housing, infrastructure and public services, as well as undermining social cohesion. The Centre for Policy Studies paper also worries the government's failure to cut migration numbers as promised is fueling distrust in politicians. Welcome back to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh and I'm the IEA's Director of Public Policy and Communications. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question. Today's question, are immigrants burdening Britain? To discuss, I'm excited to welcome to the podcast our very own Harrison Griffiths. He's a communications officer here at the IEA and the author of a new blog post this week responding to the CPS report. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with claims around the kind of broader economic implications of immigration. So the CPS report's essential claim is the UK has had a poor level of economic growth for the last 15 years. Productivity is low, wages have flatlined, etc., etc. Is that a sign, as they're saying, that immigration has been a failure?
No, I don't think so. So a lot of the contents of this report are building on certain economic arguments against immigration that have been growing in popularity, just anecdotally from what I see on kind of right-wing Twitter, so to speak. And this, for the most part, I've kind of seen people saying, well, if immigration's so good, why has productivity growth, wages flatlined in the UK over the last 15 years?
We've had record levels of immigration, hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands, in fact.
And so you can just say, well, correlation does not equal causation. There's an awful lot more to it here. But to be fair, in this report, Brian and Jenrick do say correlation isn't causation, so let's look into it a little bit more. But I still don't think that their conclusions are an affront to immigration per se. It's a lot more about government policy and how that has made wages, tax contributions stagnate for everybody, not just immigrants.
Let's get to some of the mechanisms here about how potentially the theory goes that immigrants could be undermining economic growth. I think the first one that's quite prominent there is this idea that immigrants are stretching public services and infrastructure like roads and housing, and therefore we need to slow down on the inflow of people because we haven't been able to keep up. Effectively a depleting of the capital stock argument here, that even if immigrants come into this country and contributing labour, they're more of a burden than we can handle based upon what we currently have in the capital field.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really kind of, it's a core example of where they're criticising the governments of which they've variously been a part and supported for the last 14 years. So the problem when we're talking about roads, for example, they are pretty much entirely centrally planned and funded. I mean, the actual work is often outsourced, but they're centrally planned and funded by the state. And, well, we know that when the government comes in and almost monopolises a particular sector and tries to plan it centrally, it does not have the information and the mechanisms to create and constantly update the information necessary to basically make economic decisions that are rational. And so we've seen here a story that we see in countries across the world. When you have government central planning of transport infrastructure, often there will be a shortage. And of course, so this is not unique to Britain.
One of many examples. I mean, the other cases you can cover, obviously, housing, where government policy is, as we discuss very often on this podcast, has resulted in enough houses being built. I suppose a critic could say, Harrison, you're absolutely right. The reason why we don't have that is because of government failure. But at least, as so it appears, the NIMBY coalition is too strong. We literally can't do it. And therefore, we need to pull a brake on immigration. Even if they might have some sympathies for immigration, and even have sympathies for your argument that we need to build more homes. And in fact, I suspect Neil O'Brien and Robert Jenrick even do have some sympathies on your points here. If we can't do it, as we haven't been able to do it, then we just can't keep accepting these number of immigrants.
Yeah, well, but doing that would be doubling down on the damage. It would create a double whammy, whereby you're losing the economic benefits of immigration on the basis of the fact that the government makes policy decisions that undermine the economic benefits of everything else in the economy. So housing, as you said, is like the consummate example. There is no reason why housing cannot keep up with demand, especially in the medium to long term, only unless the government comes in and imposes absurdly restrictive and unclear planning laws that prevent people from building the houses. Christian Niemitz, our colleague, has pointed out previously in a blog he wrote about the housing crisis and immigration that the UK has experienced higher population growth than we have in the last 15 years before. And so, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, experiencing relatively high population growth, and we also had a massive housing boom. Housing demand was able to be catered to because people could respond to supply. We have not seen a shortage of food on supermarket shelves because of population growth. To my knowledge, I don't think any country actually has experienced a shortage of food because purely of population growth. Why? Well, of course, it's easier to manufacture and distribute food than it is houses. I mean, there's obviously a natural barrier there to some extent. But there you have a competitive market where different enterprises with the profit motive and with the information mechanism that comes from competition in a healthy market, they have the ability to respond to demand. In the housing sector, they just don't.
There's anything as well that sometimes put as kind of an anti-immigrant argument that, well, Tesco keeps building more stores. They know there's actually more people in the country than the government even realises, which may indeed be the case because ONS seems to struggle with counting a bit of a problem since they are the Office for National Statistics. But the point here is, Tesco successfully responds to the demand and provides the food we need. Moving on to a bit of a different point here. So typically on the kind of pro-immigration side of things, the argument will go, immigrants come to the country bringing specific skills or filling gaps, even if they're lower skilled immigrants, and that helps boost our overall kind of prosperity and a level of productivity. Now, in the latest kind of series of criticism of immigration, including in this report this week, that argument's kind of turned on its head. And I think we've heard this before, but it's becoming a kind of a more prominent meme that immigrants are replacing investments in machinery. That as a result of turning on the tap of cheap, low-skilled immigrant, businesses aren't investing in the capital that Britain needs. Where again, the UK has had very poor levels of capital investment in recent years, and therefore, if we want to get up that capital investment, we can't just keep allowing so many immigrants to come to this country. Yeah,
so this, as you say, is something that's been growing in prominence for quite some time now. And it's interesting to see the way that this has really shifted on its head in the last 10 years. It used to be that the immigrants are taking the jobs, and now it's immigrants doing too many jobs and we don't have enough robots. So this has an intuitive appeal to it. It's like, well, if you restrict the labour market and cut off the tap of cheap labour, then people will just invest in capital instead. They use the example of car washes in the UK. Like automated car washes have actually declined in the UK over the last 10 years. And to be honest, that may kind of seem like regression in our economy, but it isn't necessarily. There is no fixed optimal ratio of capital to labour in an economy. The British economy today has a very different optimal ratio of capital to labour than any other economy at any other time in history. What we need to kind of figure out is what's the optimal balance. Like it's not a matter of it's not sensible to say the entire UK economy should be geared towards labour being performed by robots right now. That would be insane. So true is it that we shouldn't be planning the UK economy to be completely dependent on labour with no capital whatsoever. That would also be completely insane. But that balance is obviously best found by the market. What I think the authors should have asked themselves is why their theory implies that businesses hate profit. Because if you're a profit maximising enterprise and you have access to you've got money and access to a competitive market of labour and capital, and it would increase your productivity, increase your overall output, and allow you to decrease prices for customers. Why aren't they doing it already? wouldn't seem to make sense unless the answer is actually that for one reason or another, it is better for productivity for these businesses to invest in more labour and not necessarily more capital. I also think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about what the effect of capital actually is in this theory. So lots of people, and I've had some exchanges on Twitter today in response to my blog. A lot of people cite things like the existence of the steam engine, for example, a revolutionary technological innovation which powered the Industrial Revolution in large part. You take things, these revolutionary innovations like steam engines, like the iPhone, like potentially AI is going to be. But they tend to be the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, the capital stock rises quite slowly. The marginal return, as in, so the return of adding one more unit of labour, tends to go down as there's a larger labour force, which then increases the marginal return on capital. Once again, you invest in capital, and eventually the marginal return on capital goes down, increasing the marginal return on labour, because you need your labour force to come in and actually operate this capital. Generally speaking, labour complements capital. Capital doesn't usually replace labour in this revolutionary kind of way that they're saying.
We use AI in order to be more productive in our jobs.
Right.
It complements us by allowing us to work faster and process information and data even more quickly, and the same with a robot in a factory, that it makes each worker more productive, also higher paid. I think that's where your argument is there. I suppose the response to that would be, to some extent, maybe machinery and capital investment is a kind of response to necessity. And that I think there probably is a genuine argument here that the UK hasn't had enough capital investment.
But it depends how that necessity comes about. So they're right to say that a big part of what caused the Industrial Revolution in Britain, for example, was the fact that we had an incredibly high wage economy. But why did we have a high wage economy? Was it because the government came in and artificially restricted the supply of labour in order to boost wages? No, absolutely not. It was some combination of the fact that the UK was a large free trading nation, and because we managed to exploit coal for cheap energy much better, which sped along our urban agglomeration in cities. And there you have the unpredictable mix that gives you the Industrial Revolution. It is very different to have an economy that is increasing in size, increasing in productivity, which delivers higher wages and then stimulates investment in capital, versus one where the government just comes in and says the wages will be high now, because capital needs to be created before it's invested. And then that's a combination of labour productivity, of economic growth, and of a high savings rate.
Perhaps the simpler way to put this, I suspect, might be if we suddenly increase minimum wage £100 an hour, it wouldn't lead to a huge amount of capital investment. It would just lead to a lot of unemployment. But
absolutely. I think, and if you chop the right hand off of every working age man in Britain, every working age woman in Britain, would we see a techno utopia tomorrow? Obviously not.
Yeah, I think perhaps although the more persuasive argument, of course, is there's a lot of other countries that have just as high or higher immigration than the UK, and yet still have far more capital investment.
So Norway's got the highest capital intensity of any developed country, I believe, and it's got remarkably similar patterns of immigration. It's got a similar percentage of foreign-born residents as the UK, and it has extremely high capital intensity. It's also worth noting that while capital intensity, which is the amount of capital you have per worker in the economy, is closely correlated with productivity, that makes sense. They're not interchangeable phenomena. So Japan, for example, has higher capital productivity than the UK. Higher capital intensity than the UK, but it has lower productivity as well. So it's not just some silver bullet.
You can have loads of robots, but if they're not being particularly productive themselves, then there's not much point to them. Exactly. I suppose the conclusion here then is the productivity puzzle might still be a bit unanswered here. As in, there are a lot of other things going on in the UK economy that lead to underinvestment in machinery or capital, and that have made us poorer. But it's very much far from a firm conclusion that's as a result of immigrants. And also, I guess, the more positive case here, of course, is that we do have labour shortages, particularly in both high and low skilled areas where immigrants are fulfilling an important purpose.
I would just like to note that there is one area that they address with this argument where I think they might have a point, which is in the public sector. So the public sector has a very clear record of underinvestment in capital. So look at the NHS, for example. Basically the only time where capital investment in the NHS rose was for 3 years in the Blair era. It's compared to other countries, health systems ridiculously low. So there is a point, I think, when we say that the government's management of certain sectors, particularly where it has a near monopoly, such as in healthcare, politicians are incentivized to make short-term decisions. If you're the health secretary and you're staring down the barrel of a week of headlines about the latest NHS winter crisis, and you've got a pot of money from the Treasury, are you going to use it for a short-term cash injection, or are you going to put it towards some kind of capital project which won't pay off for many years and that you'll probably never get the credit for anyway? Obviously, the incentives are geared towards short-term spending and not capital investment. But again, that's a product of the failures of government central planning. It's not a product of immigrants. But it is indeed possible that because of that failure, we have been, in effect, artificially subsidising labour and artificially subsidising immigration. And that's certainly a bad thing.
So I think that the next major claim from the Climate Immigration Critical Report this week is that immigration, particularly from outside of the EU, although some EU immigrants as well, drains government finances. This is the sense in which rather than immigrants coming to the UK, working and paying taxes, actually a lot of them don't necessarily work. And if you do kind of, a longer term calculation of the burdens that they're going to place onto the welfare state and public services, they're actually net negative burdens.
Yeah. So this may well be true as well. It's an incredibly difficult thing to measure. For one thing, as I think you've already mentioned, the data is terrible. The government just cannot produce accurate stats on how many people have come here, why they've come here, and what their economic performance is. So that creates a barrier in the first place. But even if you had some kind of perfect set of statistics from the government, you'd still have a bit of a methodological problem. So, for example, how do we attribute the costs and the contributions to certain pure public goods like national defence, for example? The national debt as well. Is it fair to attribute an equal portion of the national debt to an immigrant who arrived yesterday when almost all of it was accumulated before they arrived? How, for example, public sector net debt can you can be a net you can be a net beneficiary of the state and still reduce public sector debt per head, so long as you're
less of a burden than other people.
If you're less of a burden than the average person here at the moment, you can still do that. So these are just a few of the very difficult questions about how to actually apportion government tax and spending. And depending on how you choose to apportion that, you can get wildly different results. So in 2014, there was a big tete-a-tete between a pair of researchers who had basically written a paper saying that the contribution, particularly of EU immigrants, was very positive. And then Migration Watch, who came back and said, actually, no, it's not. And most of the gap between the two can be explained by the different ways they choose to allocate those resources and answer those questions. So it's a difficult one to ask. So it's a different one to answer. But what basically all studies on this show is that the net contribution of EU immigrants and non-EU immigrants has declined since the 2008 Great Financial Crash. So too has the average net tax contribution of the UK citizens as well. And there's obviously an awful lot there. We've had, stagnating wages, stagnating productivity. The tax system has become slightly more progressive in many ways, and immigrants are probably more likely to be on a low wage, particularly if they've just arrived. So again, we're talking about much broader economic phenomenon. It's not just immigrants are inherently a drain, because it seems they were much less of one. Even if you say they weren't positive, they were much less of a drain before 2008.
I mean, effectively, they're all, everyone is a drain on the state or scheduled to be, because we're promised so much into the future.
Precisely.
It might be another way to put it. I mean,
it's another reminder of the unsustainable position of government taxing and spending.
I suppose, though, that it sounds like, to a large part, you're sympathetic to their case here, at least that you say that there's potentially something to it. They might think about it and say, well, then why does the Office of Budget Responsibility have such a positive view of the fiscal contribution of immigrants? They say immigration goes up, is at 1%, and public finances go up at the same time. Is that perhaps to do with the different timelines they're looking at? That in the immediate term, immigrants are positive, but in the longer term, they're negative? What do you think accounts for the OBR's relatively positive view of immigrants that the complaint is often drives policy making?
Yeah, so I think that the bigger impression that comes out of the OBR's modelling and projections on this is that you want to avoid the loss from drastically cutting immigration. So the OBR shows a big loss to public finances and an increase in the national debt, for example, if we go for a low immigration scenario. Now, Robert Colville, the director of the CPS, has criticised this by saying that the OBR, as often the OBR has a problem with, it just takes all other things being equal and staying as they are, if we just cut the numbers, what would the public sector contributions, spending and tax look like? What they would argue, I guess, is that we would change the mixture of immigrants as well, like who are coming in. So yes, we might cap it at 90,000, but the people coming in, we want to be very high skilled immigrants. I would quite like to see that model by the OBR, because I don't disagree with anyone's criticisms about the OBR not incorporating dynamic impacts of changes in policy to their projections. What the impacts, it's not just a spreadsheet calculation. It is a chronic problem with the OBR, and so I would quite like to see that. But the modelling does show that if you did just cap the numbers, then we might be looking at a less positive situation. Admittedly, the OBR does kind of support one of their other arguments, in that it does argue that GDP per head would probably go down in a high immigration scenario, or continuing as we are now, and it might go up slightly if we have a low immigration scenario.
And that's buying into the capital is not being invested side of the argument, as in we're not building enough infrastructure, we're not building enough houses, and therefore quality of life per person goes down.
But there's also a trade-off between, let's say we completely accept the OBR's projections on this, and they say that perhaps the GDP per head of the country might go down if we stay in the high immigration scenario. But there is a trade-off there between the broader economic consequences of immigration and the fiscal consequences of immigration, because GDP, total GDP, matters far more for fiscal considerations, because taxation, for example, and the national debt is not necessarily allotted per head. We don't all pay an equal share of tax, for example. So on one hand, the fiscal policymakers, the wonks in the Treasury, Treasury-brained people, I guess they're called a lot, they want to see GDP total go up, but perhaps we might want to care more about GDP per capita as a broader economic measure.
Yeah, I suppose, again, it's about making that assessment of the immigrants, and whether or not they are some kind of fiscal burden, or whether they need to be. I mean, another point to also think about here is probably whether or not immigrants should be required to pay their own way to a larger extent, or have less access to public services.
Yeah.
And there's already the fact that government's put up the NHS surcharge to £1,000 a year, which is not really an NHS surcharge, is effectively just an immigrant tax, that if you get a 3-year visa, you have to pay £3,000 in addition to whatever you're paying in tax. And I suspect if people are coming in on those work visas and paying that level of NHS surcharge on net, you would think that they would have to be a fiscal contributor. Perhaps it's some of the other immigrants, where it's the family dependent immigrants and the students and the refugees who are not paying those fees, or not paying the same extent of those fees, or aren't working with the burden.
I mean, so most people who are on student visas do leave once their visa is up. A lot of them who then change onto another visa and kind of contribute and work here. Again, I don't really see why we have a problem with that. You've got someone who's just obtained a degree at a British university, and they've gone on to, apply that skill and fill some gap, or do a better job than a native worker, perhaps, in the British economy. Don't think we should really have a problem with that.
They've also probably just paid a lot of money in order to get that degree.
Yeah, so but it's a massive export for us. And of course, the immigrants subsidise the capped fees for everybody else. Like the university system is completely unsustainable in a lot of ways because of the capped tuition fees. But the system as it is at the moment, fewer students coming into the university system from abroad will mean fewer places available for people in the UK. Now, that's a whole separate discussion, but I don't think it's a massive drain on that front.
I suppose the next major issue brought up in this report is this question about public concern about immigration.
Yeah.
And this constant promise by politicians that they'll bring immigration down to the tens of thousands. I think technically actually wasn't in the last Tory manifesto, but I think they said that decreased immigration. It was at something like 250,000. It's now probably likely peaked, but well over 700,000 and staying relatively high. Do you put any, I suppose, weight into the concerns about the public preferences when it comes to immigration levels?
Yeah, so my criticism of this paper is mostly on economic grounds, and that's what we do. And this is clearly a very intentional attempt to take the growing concern about immigration and put give it some economic legitimacy, because generally speaking, there's a very wide economic consensus that a liberal immigration policy is a good thing. Like, the most immigration skeptical conclusions you'll get out of serious economic studies will be there's some minor short-term displacement of low-skilled native workers from immigration, which is then offset on net later down the line because it frees up natives basically to be more specialised and to be more productive themselves. By the way, also something else that's very difficult to account for in fiscal contributions is in the long run, if you've got a more specialised and therefore productive native population as a consequence of low-skilled immigrants, they will be paying more in tax. They will be making less of a net, they'll be being less of a net burden or making more of a net contribution than they would otherwise have done. As you can imagine, that's just basically impossible to calculate, but it's still a very real consideration. So what they've tried to do here is to challenge that economic consensus, and I think they failed in that attempt, really. But the points they raise outside of economics, are reasonably salient. The strongest cases for a more restrictive immigration policy are about integration and culture, and many of those arguments do have merit, particularly when we've changed from a system of disproportionately EU migrants coming in because of free movement to one where, I mean, the EU migrants are kind of net leaving the UK at the moment, and the lion's share of this rise in immigration is non-EU. There are genuinely serious questions about that are far stronger than the economic case. They also mentioned democratic legitimacy as well. And again, they have a point. People, the opinion polls show us that people pretty consistently want a reduction in immigration. I'm well aware that my very liberal view on immigration is a minority opinion, but that has been happening now for at least 20 years and nobody's done anything about it. Yeah, I mean, there is a legitimate case that it undermines faith in politics. The economics still aren't there, though.
I mean, there's also a bit of a tension here in terms of the polling, which is that people say, yes, they want the overall numbers to go down. But if you ask about nurses, doctors, care workers, even about fruit pickers and construction workers, people will generally say, yes, I'm happy with the amount or happy for there to be more of those specific categories. Same story around Ukrainian and Hong Kong refugees. I mean, on the other end of that, there's probably the boat arrivals, which I think probably have a toxic effect on the overall immigration debate because it creates that sense of loss of control and a genuinely quite high numbers of people coming over that the government kind of releases and loses track of in quite high numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the small boat issue has certainly had a toxifying effect on this. I mean, you saw a moderating effect after Brexit on people's views about immigration because of this idea that it could be controlled now. We have a sovereign right to decide. Small boats has taken that completely in the opposite direction. But that is a very separate issue and very much a small fraction of the people who are arriving. Since the small boat controversy took hold and people started really paying attention to it, the immigration skeptics have turned their focus rightly on their own terms towards legal immigration. But yeah, I mean, you're right to say that there is a contradiction in public opinion. And this is sort of one of the inherent problems of politics and political decision making, is that what people say they want is, it's interesting, and it obviously matters for politicians if they care enough to vote on it, but it doesn't actually have any interaction with reality. If I tell a pollster, if somebody asks me, do you want a massive house in Beverly Hills with white picket fences and a beautiful view of the valley? I'd say, yeah.
And a beautiful wife and children.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, got it. Where do I sign up? But obviously, I need to take that preference and reconcile it with the material realities of the real world. In politics, you can't do that. And so often you will have people's preferences because they don't have to be reconciled with, the material realities of the world. You can just say you want something and a politician is supposed to care about that. Often you will have contradictory opinions stated, because there's absolutely no incentive for people to be consistent. There's no incentive for people to order their preferences in a more sensible way. And so there you have this issue right now. People's number one concern is the economy. People's number two concern is the NHS. It would be very difficult, even if you think that in the long run it would pay off for the NHS or even the economy, to immediately cut the numbers of immigrants and still have those two on a sound footing. So people seem to care about those two things more than immigration. How do you reconcile those preferences? people's general attitudes towards immigration don't comport when you then ask them, okay, which sectors do we want to cut immigration in? I'm not a politician. I'm never going to be. I'm really thankful for that for many reasons, including the fact that I don't have to concern myself with reconciling that. Best of luck to anybody who tries.
So I wanted to get your final thoughts on the kind of central recommendation of the report, which is to reduce immigration back to 1990s levels. I think that means in the tens of thousands. And also this concept kind of interrelated there that we're going to be the grammar school approach. We're going to take the best and brightest of the world who can fill necessary high school jobs, but a lot less lower school immigration, particularly a lot less, let's say, care workers, for example, but you think less hospitality workers, if there's that many of them coming over, I'm not sure. Certainly fewer fruit and vegetable pickers for the agricultural sector. So no more low-skilled labour, a lot fewer students, a lot fewer dependents, just those really, cream of the crop, high-skilled workers.
Yeah. So on the dependents thing, again, they have a point to some extent that will obviously make immigration more of a net fiscal burden if you have people not working. There are certain groups of immigrants. So, for example, Muslim women immigrants in the UK are significantly less likely to be in full-time work than the average woman in the UK from any other group, and certainly much less than the average of any sex and gender. And obviously that's a bit of a problem. But you do also have the issue to solve when it comes to are you disincentivising the high-skilled workers you want from coming over if you can't let them bring your dependents. This attempt to hike the threshold needed for a British citizen to sponsor their spouse to come over here, it's a tiny number of people that actually do that, but are you then incentivising people to emigrate, which is going to become a much bigger problem in the UK over the next few years? That's certainly something they've done to me. And so, these are not easy issues to reconcile, and it's generally speaking, not easy to centrally plan the labour force, which is essentially what this is. Do we have government centrally planned skills, ill-defined, government centrally planned allocation of which businesses get what skilled workers? That massively opens the door for crony capitalism as well. It's going to be the most politically well-connected, most politically important industries that probably have preferential access to these visas. By what mechanism can the government know, can it ever know, what skills the economy needs at any given moment? It can't. So I'm immediately suspicious. What it will probably end up doing is benefiting businesses and sectors that are already large and well established in the UK, but it still won't solve the issue, which is that in lots of low-skilled occupations there is a bit of a labour shortage. Now, there's a huge element of government welfare policy here. Again, a case where perhaps we are subsidising immigration by allowing so many Brits not to work through government policies. That's a whole separate discussion. But they're not actually going to solve the real issues by just saying, here's an arbitrary number that we pulled out of the air because it's only 5 figures instead of 6. They're not going to be solving any problems with that other than just being able to signal, yeah, we cut immigration, or at least we want to cut immigration. And I think it's important to defend low-skilled immigration as well. So basically no one denies, even some of these hardcore immigration skeptics, that high-skilled immigration is a very good thing. That just the immediate effect of that further specialises the economy and fills in gaps in the labour force. That's a good thing. No one denies it. Low-skilled immigration seems to be where the target of the ire is, but low-skilled immigration still allows somebody else to specialise somewhere, usually, ironically, in more capital-intensive industries. Particularly when we're talking about care, that's something that's going to be a very difficult problem for lots of reasons for the government over the coming years. But it's also quite difficult to see, compared with, say, any manufacturing sector, how capital could do an awful lot to improve the productivity of labourers, never mind replace them. It's a very hands-on, human-to-human profession. It's going to be something that's very difficult to solve. And without cutting the number of people who come into work in care and in health, generally speaking, you are not going to get anywhere near to the tens of thousands figure. You're just not.
Well, Harrison Griffiths, Communications Officer here at the IEA, thank you so much for joining the IEA podcast. If you are enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider. And if you'd like to learn more about the IEA's work, just visit iea.org.uk.